Okay, well today I'm going to be talking about Aristotle's concept of God. But in order to get there, we really have to start with something about the Platonic picture. It doesn't take long for Plato's scheme to fall apart. Now there are many important Platonists throughout the history of the Christian tradition and the history of Western philosophy in general. Augustine, Anselm, Descartes are three prominent examples of Platonists. However, Plato's own students tended not to be Platonists. In fact, within one generation after Plato's death, there was no Platonism at Plato's Academy. In fact, the Academy became known as the seat of skepticism. And later, when Augustine or others argue against the skeptics, they will often say contra academicos. In other words, against the people at the Academy, who are all identified as skeptics. Now, how did Plato's view collapse into skepticism within one generation? Why were all of his students basically skeptics? Let's think about what Plato really does. I'm going to draw a bubble here, which is the mind. And I'm going to think about that mind as thinking about something. So what do you want to think about? It could be anything. Give me an example. What could we think about?
Food.
Food. Okay, good. So here is some yummy bit of food. Yeah, let's make it specific.
Banana.
A banana. Okay, good. So here we have a banana. It's like a hot dog. But anyway, it's a banana. Believe it or not, I took a year of art, drawing, painting, and all this to get this good. And my teachers thought I was terrific. They were insane. Anyway, okay, so I have this thought now. I'm thinking about the banana. I'm seeing the banana and thinking about it. So here is this. That's meant to be just sort of a zapping in the mind there. Something's happening in the mind. And I am thinking about that banana. I'm perceiving the banana. And so we can say, yeah, in general, this relationship is a relationship of perception. It's basically a causal relationship. The exact details of that aren't clear for a very long time, but that there's some kind of causal relationship involved seems clear. Now, Plato says, it's not just that I see that thing, right? I see it and I think a thought. And the content of my thought is, let's say, there's a banana. So, this has some content. I'll draw that in with a sort of cartoon-type bubble. And the content is, there's a banana. Perhaps I'm hungry and I want to eat it. But anyway, I'm noticing there's a banana. And now how do I do that? How is it possible for me to recognize that object in the world as a banana?
You've been taught who's a banana.
Good. I've been taught what a banana is. I've learned the word banana, for example. I have the concept of a banana. And so there's something in my mind, some general concept. Let's put this here. Let's say I've got this banana concept. I've been taught that. And so I apply that to this thing. Now, here's a sort of problem. It might be that you have one concept of a banana, I have another concept of a banana, and so on and so forth. Maybe one person likes a banana, another person doesn't. Maybe somebody doesn't really know what a banana is, this is the first time they've ever seen it, and so on. So we might differ in our banana concepts, right? We might not all have, in fact, it would be really hard to define. Give me a definition of a banana.
Tasty yellow fruit.
Tasty yellow fruit, okay, good first try, but are there other tasty yellow fruits?
Maybe bananas aren't tasty at all.
Ooh, maybe somebody doesn't like a banana, but also, yeah, what's another tasty yellow fruit? Yeah, a pineapple, right? A lemon, a lime that's not fully ripe. What else? Yellow apples, good. There's that, what is it called? A star fruit or something? Anyway, there are all sorts of things like that. Now Plato says, well, yeah, look, there's all sorts of stuff going on like that. And indeed, we're going to end up being skeptics or being relativists if we're trapped just with the individual ideas we have. Because then when you think that's a banana, and I think that's a banana, and so on, we're attributing very different things. We're thinking different thoughts. However, Plato says, no. Look, there is a form of a banana. And here it is. Put it over here. It is there. Okay, this is the form of a banana. And so, and actually, I mean, it's a little silly, he doesn't talk about banana forms, but actually he does think there's a form for every natural kind, and a banana would be a natural kind. So he thinks there's a form of a banana. And it's by virtue of that, really, that my concept of a banana is a concept of a banana. It is moreover because of that, that this thought really is, sorry, I should draw that not to my word, to the form. This relates to the form. And then we can say this individual banana, moreover, exemplifies or instantiates or participates in that form. So we've got a relation of participation here that tells us what the connection is between this individual banana and the general form of the banana. It's a funny kind of relation. It's really a logical relation. It's not a causal relation in Plato. This has the properties that make it a banana, and so it exemplifies or participates in the form. Well, what about this thought? What is the connection between it and the form of a banana? Now, it's at this point that Plato's picture gets complicated. The idea is supposed to be we defeat the skeptic, we defeat the relativist, we defeat all sorts of potential opponents by thinking, look, there is this form of a banana that exists outside any individual's head. Now, that's how it's possible for us to have objective truth about this and be talking about the same thing and thinking the same thought and so on. But now, how do you and I connect to that abstract form of a banana?
Touching.
Maybe the knowledge that we can't change it.
Ah, okay, somebody first said touch it. Notice we can touch the individual banana, but we can't touch the form. The knowledge we can't change it. Well, it is true we can't change that. But now, how do we know we actually have it right? We mentioned that people might have different banana concepts. Somebody might think it's a tasty yellow fruit because they like bananas. Somebody else might think it's a yucky yellow fruit because they don't like bananas. Some people might think, yes, it's that thing you buy in the grocery store, but it's only good for a couple of days. Somebody might think like me, well, actually, I like them really mushy. So you buy it in the grocery store, and then you have to wait a week until it turns kind of brown, and then it's yummy. Everybody else in my house is grossed out. Basically, when they want to throw the bananas away, that's when I think they're about ready to eat. In any case, we might have those differences, right? Who's really got the form of the banana? Now, for Plato, he has to say, really, yeah, this is a relationship that is initially puzzling. He's got to tell you something about what that relationship is. But now the difficulty is, how do we do it? What is that connection? How do I relate to the abstract? After all, it's an abstract form, right? It is not in a sensible world. I sense the individual bananas, I can perceive them, I can taste them, I can see them, I can touch them. But the form of a banana? I haven't felt the form of a banana or tasted the form of a banana. I've come close. I've eaten a banana right off the tree in Costa Rica. And at the time I joked, this is the platonic form of a banana. But of course it's not really the platonic form of a banana. It did taste so much better than anything we get here. But in any case, that's something that is really not something we can directly sense. Well, if we can't sense it, how do we connect to it at all? Now, it is by virtue of the form of the banana in Plato that we are able to think the thought that that is a banana. And so this has some kind of causal power. I drew this as an arrow going in this way. Well, this has to be an arrow going in this way too. The form of a banana here has to have some causal power. It is by virtue of the form that I can think the thought that that is a banana. But what's the nature of its causal power? Forms are abstractions. They don't seem to be causes. And in fact, one of Aristotle's objections in Book 12 of the Metaphysics is precisely forms can't be what it's all about because forms aren't causes. So how is it possible for me to think about these abstract forms? How do I, in short, know anything about the forms? I've got a serious epistemological problem about Plato because I basically tell you, look, there's this realm of forms. In fact, the sensible world is merely an imitation of this realm of forms. It's great, it's wonderful in all of us. And then you say, yeah, how do you know any of this? It's like, oh, yeah, right. It's sort of like, once upon a time, there were three forms living in platonic heaven. Okay? And those forms became other forms and participated and blended out, blah, 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 blah. And there were lots of forms and they all lived happily ever after. You say, yeah, why should I believe any of that? How do I know anything about these forms? Now, Plato actually, in his entire body of work, never gives you an answer to this. And in fact, in his later dialogues, advances this argument himself. And really has Socrates being a figure who doesn't have a very good reply to it, for example, in the Sophist. But he does, at a couple of points, tell you a story. Now, some people think that whenever Plato gets remarkably deep, he tells you a myth, he tells you a story. I think whenever Plato's out of juice, whenever he's got nothing to say, he tells you a story, okay? So you can either think this is deep or this is a sign of ignorance. He's like, yeah, I got nothing, so I'll tell you some myth. Okay, that's what I think is going on. It's like the student asks the embarrassing question, you don't know what to say, and you say, well, let me tell you a story, right? Politicians do this all the time. Let me tell you about Joe from Cleveland, right? Yeah, that means you got nothing. That means you're making crap up. And so what's happening here is he tells us these stories. Now he tells us two stories, really. One of them appears in the Meno. And what's the Meno story? He says, well, here's the myth. Before you were born, your soul existed, and it was there cohabiting in the realm of the forms. And the forms were imprinted upon your soul because it was in constant contact with them. But then you were born, and in being born you had to cross the river of forgetting, and you forgot the forms. But the imprints are still there on your soul. And philosophy is reminding you of the imprints that were there on your soul before you were born. So in the Meno, this is a process of recollection. You just have to be reminded of the forms. Now, is that a good answer?
It just pushes the problem one more step. How do you know that that's the way that is? It doesn't give you definite proof that, I mean, it explains the problem of how do you know anything about forms, but it doesn't, go any, I mean, there's no way to verify that, there's no way to doubt that, it's just what one guy says.
Right. Okay, good. This really does just push the thing one step back, and in two ways. One is the way you mentioned. Wait, you're telling me another story I have to believe? Why should I believe that? How do you know that, Plato? You're saying before I was born, my soul lived in this place, and the forms were there, and we knew each other on a first-name basis, and then somehow I all forgot it, because across this river, how do you know any of that, right? By your own account, we had to forget it all. And so it looks like it's worse than a story that just is like the three bear story where you might say, how do you know? It's like here, actually your story itself implies that I can't know that it's true. So it's really bad. It's sort of like the story where, oh yes, and we all forgot about it at the end. It's like, how do I tell that story? What if Subby had done that with the story of the three bears? Once upon a time, there lived three bears together in a cottage in the woods. And at the end of the story, actually in that story, it's not Goldilocks, a young girl, it's an old, nasty woman who breaks into the cottage. But in any event, at the end, suppose he said, and then a witch arrived and cast a spell so that no one would ever remember this story. That would be weird, right? Well, then how did you just tell it to us, right? And so it's like that, actually. It's not just how you know, but wait, your own story implies we can't know. But it's even worse than that, because there's another sense in which it pushes it back one step further and doesn't answer the real question. Our question is, how do the forms have this causal power? How do they actually affect our minds? Well, to say, here's how they affect our minds now, because before we were born, they affected our minds. If my question is, how can they have any influence on my mind at all? To say, oh, it happened before you were born, is no answer of any kind, right? It's sort of like saying, I'm wondering how this kind of thing can do this. And to say, well, it used to do it, but I want to know how it's possible at all. Now or before, I don't see how that actually makes any difference. Sort of like somebody says, I've got this car that can fly. I say, really? I don't believe that. Show me. So I go to their place, they show me the car, it doesn't fly. And I said, well, see, cars don't fly. He said, well, it used to fly. Okay? Do I say, oh yeah, okay, cool, I believe you now. No, it's sort of like that. How do I think these can actually affect my mind, affect my thought, and exert causal power on me? To say, well, they used to, is no answer at all. Now, the second attempt he makes is in the Republic. And this is what you read for last time. This is where he gives you the account of the form of the good. Okay? And he tells you, yeah, well, it's all about the good. Maybe the form of a banana doesn't actually have any causal power, but the form of the good does. And so he says, oh, and I haven't actually left myself room for this, because it's got to be over here in the realm of forms, and I wanted it to be up above, but I'll put it here, sort of. The good, okay, is here. He says it's like the sun; it shines its light upon the entire realm of forms. And so the idea is, yeah, I realize that's ugly and not well drawn, but the idea is, here's how it's possible. You know, you might think, look, this realm of the mind, this intelligible world, as it's later called, how is it intelligible? How can I see? Well, Plato, in the allegory of the cave, says I come out of the cave, and at first I can't see. It's blinding. But I start looking at reflections, and then I look at the objects, and then I can actually finally look and gaze at the sun itself. And so eventually I can see, there's a source of light. There is something that makes it possible for me to see this, namely the form of the good. Now, is that a good answer? Just on Plato's own terms. Why not?
You don't know what the good is.
Okay, one problem is, what do you mean, the form of the good? I don't know what the good is. In fact, look, if we ask people here, what's a banana? We're going to get a lot more agreement than if we say, what is good? Okay? A lot more disagreement about what the good is. So if the idea is supposed to be, this is clear in a way that these others aren't, that doesn't seem to be true. It's the least clear. But now, what else is problematic about that particular answer? Yeah?
One big metaphor?
Well, it is one big metaphor, and that's something we could say about both of these. It's sort of like, well, okay, I've got this analogy. You say it's like the sun sheds light on everything. But now, first of all, that's just a story, right? Just a metaphor. It's not something that actually gives me a theory of anything. Moreover, think about what it's doing in the story, right? What is the sun doing? In the real world, what does the sun do? How does it enable us to see things? It shines light, right? It acts as a cause, and it sends light out, and that light bounces off all sorts of things, and eventually gets into the eye. So, okay, we can tell a causal story, and it is the origin of the causal story. So here we have to say, all right, what Plato's saying is there's some kind of causal story I can tell, by virtue of which the good acts as a cause, and it's by virtue of its causal power that I can know something about the form of a banana, let's say. The form of a banana doesn't have any causal power of its own, but it gets a kind of indirect or secondary causal power from the form of the good. Now here's the thing. Our question was, how can the forms exert causal power? Answer number one, well, they used to. Answer number two, it's all this one that does it. Okay? Now, I don't understand how a form can be a cause. And if you say, well, it's just this one form, see, the form of the good is a cause, that doesn't answer my question either. I want to know, how is it possible for it to exert causal power? And to say it's like the sun, okay, I get what you're saying, it's the cause, but I don't understand how it's possible for it to be a cause. So one objection is, yeah, it's just a story, it's just an analogy or a metaphor. But moreover, if you think about the metaphor, you realize it's a question-begging metaphor. It's not like I think about the sun and say, that's how it does it. Now, it could be. I could say, well, here it is. How does the sun actually manage to shine light out so far? Well, it's got a tremendous amount of energy, right? There's nuclear fusion taking place all the time. So maybe we say, that's it. Good, it's filled with energy, nuclear fusion. But no, that's not right. There's no story like that forthcoming, right? And so there's a metaphor, but nothing that can back it up. We're left with the same problem. Okay, the good is supposed to exert causal power. How can it do it? Yeah?
Are these forms actual incidences of objects on the earth? Or are they just like ideas in your mind?
Okay, good. The Greek term for the forms is ideon, okay, idea. And so one interpretation is to say, look, this is needless. They're just in the head, right? In the way that ideas are in the head. Then it's just my banana concept and your banana concept and everything like that. And then we don't have to worry about all of this. We can say, how did he get his banana concept? Well, he said, somebody taught him, right? Somebody told me what a banana was. I heard other people around me using the term banana. I figured out what they were talking about. And so there's no particular puzzle about figuring out how I could have the concept of the banana. But now suppose we leave it there. We say, yeah, it's nothing outside the head. It's just your concept, my concept. The forms are in the head. Does that solve Plato's problem? It leaves us with another problem. What's the problem it leaves us with?
Isn't it a relativist position?
Okay, good. We end up being sophists. We end up being relativists. Because then we're in the position of saying, when he said it was a banana, that was true for him because of the way he uses the word banana. Banana for him means anything yellow. It sounds very stupid, but imagine that it's, a 1-year-old who just calls everything yellow a banana. That's possible. And you might say, okay, so banana means yellow for him. That makes a certain amount of sense. But now if we do that about everything, then someone says, look, justice demands blah, blah, blah. You can say, well, that's true for you because that's your concept of justice, not my concept of justice. How do we sort out who's right? There's no such thing as being right. There's nothing to be right about. You just have your idea of justice, I have my idea of justice. You have your idea of friendship, I have my idea of friendship. And so on. And so we end up being relativists if we get rid of everything outside the mind, or at least that's Plato's worry. That's why he puts them there in the first place. And so, basically, we're stuck with what? Either we tell a better story than he manages to come up with, or We're relativists, we're skeptics, we're subjectivists, we're something. Either you think there's a truth there to be gotten at and we can't get it, or there's no truth to be gotten at and we're just relativists. And there's a best truth for us. Yeah?
Are there specific ways to define objects so they're not relative, like specific ways of talking about things, or are they all going to be influenced by good?
Well, they might not all be influenced by the good in any direct way, at least, but we'll run into the same problem. You might say, well, what if we define things explicitly in science or in mathematics, for example? The way we try to get around this is to come up with definitions. We don't just say, what's a triangle? Oh, you know, it's kind of like that thing in the orchestra, whatever. No, we actually define what a triangle is in geometry, right? And so you might think, let's just give clear definitions. The problem is, you have to define some things in terms of other things. And maybe those things in terms of other things. And as Aristotle points out, that can't go on forever. At some point, there are things that you just introduce without definition. As in fact you do in geometry. Euclid says, let's start with a point and a line. And try to define things in terms of that. And actually in Hilbert's geometry, you also need the relation of betweenness. But you can spin all of geometry out of those basic notions. But can you define what it is for one thing to be between two other things? Can you define what a point is? Not really, right? Those are things that can't be defined within the theory. And so his worry is, even if you define some things in terms of other concepts, so we're clear about that, what are the basic things that are undefined? Maybe we differ about those. And he doesn't see a way out. Now, I've introduced all of this to say Aristotle's going to try to solve this problem. He thinks the forms are going to get you into this difficulty no matter what you do, and you need a different story. Yeah?
I really like Plato on construction, and I think even though the myths aren't final resolutions to the nature of reality, I think they're still helpful in pointing out things that we experience, like things in the world and senses come into being and they perish. Like none of us have an intrinsic ability to sustain our own existence, and so I think the realm of the forms is a helpful way of thinking of that extrinsic, permanent something that kind of grounds everything in reality that kind of is in a constant state of flux. And I know Aristotle will provide a more refined and better solution to the epistemological problem, but it's I think it's a kind of cool starting place for dealing with these issues.
Right. Okay, yeah. First of all, a point about methodology. With all these philosophers, I'm going to be introducing views, but also trying to point out problems with views, so I want to beat up on them somewhat. That doesn't mean I don't like them, or I don't think they're making important contributions. And I'm sometimes going to do that with, Paul, or other people you might think, but wait, it's the Word of God, okay? And so I'm going to treat basically everybody in here as a philosopher who's in, fair game, and I'm going to whack them with things I think are problems. Now, we're going to see a bunch of Platonists in this course, like Augustine, or Origen, or Anselm, and they're going to think, look, I've got a solution to these problems, okay? So to point out that Plato's proposed solutions are at best just stories or seem to beg the question, I don't mean to say there isn't a way of doing this. In fact, to get ahead of ourselves a bit, it's very easy to see from the point of view of the later tradition how to fix this, okay? Suppose you want to keep this story, but you admit, I don't see how the forms can have any causal power. That causal power has to come from somewhere else. Where could it come from?
God.
Yeah. Okay, the forms can't do anything, but God can do anything. Just erases it. Then problem solved. And indeed, that's what we'll see a variety of people do. That's what Philo does, essentially. He says, what are these forms? They're just ideas in God's mind. Okay, that's move number one. Move number two, how do I know anything about them? God shows them to me. Okay, God's like the guy on the street corner who has all those watches and says, want to see some watches? Rolexes, here they are. Okay, and hopefully what God shows us aren't counterfeits, but actually that's, the reason I use that particular metaphor is that's Descartes' worry later with the deceiver. What if God is showing us counterfeits and not real Rolexes? What if that's a counterfeit triangle and not a real triangle? A counterfeit banana and not a real one? And it becomes a puzzle. How can we be sure what is revealed in God's mind is really God's mind and not some fake? Yeah?
If these forms are just ideas and these ideas come from talking with people, why don't we just say these people are causally related?
Ah, good. Okay, so here's one thing we could do. Basically, if we want to fix Platonism's problems, we can go that route. And then we've got an actually pretty satisfying story. That remains a very powerful attempt to solve all of this and a pretty stable philosophical response, at least until Descartes introduces that worry and people think, wait, how do I tell that story? Now, there's still a lot to be said about how God's ideas and our ideas relate and so forth. But nevertheless, that's one way of trying to solve this problem. And it's a way that is almost there in Plato. He does talk about the form of the good almost as if it's God, but he doesn't quite make the move. And it falls to later thinkers to make the move and patch it up in that way. So that's one way to go. Now, another way is what you've just suggested. To say, look, get rid of these abstract forms. Get rid of the form of the good here and so on. Let's tell a different kind of story. How is it that I know what a banana is? Very first answer that somebody proposed is, well, I learned this, right? People taught me this. So here's another way of accounting for this. To say, look, I've got this concept of a banana, and in fact this relationship isn't participation now, it's something that goes back to the concept. And so we don't want to say the object participates in the concept, rather the concept applies to the object. That's still a logical sort of relation. Now, it's not from having the concept already that I'm able to think of something as a banana. I mean, maybe some concepts are like that. Rationalists think there are some innate concepts, and indeed you can see how Platonists tend to be rationalists. But Aristotle says, let's don't assume that. Don't put anything in the mind at the beginning. Certainly when we have everyday concepts like bananas, we don't think people are innately given the concept of a banana, right? Do you think a baby already knows before it's born or when it's born what a banana is and it's just waiting to be reminded? No, it learns what a banana is. And if you wonder about banana, let's take something that's an artifact term. Do you think that a baby is born knowing what a cell phone is? Surely not, right? It's something that is learned. And so the idea is, look, it's from perceiving things and hearing things and hearing people use language and so on that the concept is formed. In other words, there is, yes, this causal process involved in perception, but then there's another process of concept formation. And that process is also a causal process. It involves perception, it involves people's uses of language, it involves the process of correction, as people say, banana? No, that's not a banana, that's a scarf. Banana? No, that's a lemon. This is a banana. Oh, no, okay. Now, actually, one of the things that pushes Chomsky, for example, toward rationalism, and thereby toward Platonism, is he thinks kids don't get enough of that. Parents never say no, essentially. Kids see lots of positive examples, but parents don't really correct children much. This is the argument from the poverty of the stimulus in linguistics, that parents just don't seem to give kids much information. If a child, points at a yellow truck and says banana, what do parents do? They laugh. Okay? They chuckle. And so the child gets positive reinforcement. And so it's like, but anyway, Aristotle's account, and this is now Aristotle's view we're working on, is to say, that's how it takes place. Really, I get my concepts in this sort of causal way. Now, how is it that I have the same concept that you have? Well, because the causal processes are pretty much the same. Look, the objects out there in the world, and now we can talk about the form of the object. There is the matter that the banana consists of, but there is also the form of the banana that is in the banana itself. But now Aristotle is putting that form in the object. It's not something that exists in some other realm where it exists eternally and in no causal contact with us. This is something that simply gives the banana its shape. And so the form here isn't something mysterious. It's a sensible form. It is something that we perceive. Now, there's a lot we can say about how, in Aristotle's view, we actually manage to perceive the sensible form and how it gets translated into this. But the idea is, look, we're seeing bananas that are pretty similar. This would become a problem if we were exposed to very different stimuli. As occasionally, well, okay, real life example. If you grow up in the Northeast, what are ants? They're these little things, they're annoying, they get into food, but they're not to be feared. They're just an annoyance. If you grew up in Texas, it's An ant is to be feared. It will often bite you, right? And it's painful and so on. But if you're from Texas and you go to the Northeast and you exhibit fear of ants, people laugh at you. It's like, what kind of wimp is afraid of ants, right? Ants are the weakest possible creature, couldn't possibly hurt you. That person has never seen a fire ant. And so it's, in that case, radically different stimuli, and so people do end up with different concepts of what ants are because they've seen very different types. But as long as that's not true, as long as we're exposed to bananas of the same general kind, then the causal processes are similar enough that they yield similar results. And so that's supposed to be the idea of why this doesn't end you up in relativism, or if there's a relativism, it's a relativism to your broad linguistic community of people who more or less use the language the same and have undergone similar experiences and so on. Now, there's a story here then of how this is to come about. It's a story where everything comes in through perception. And so Aristotle, as I mentioned, is an empiricist. What does it mean that he's an empiricist? Well, it means two things, really. One is that all concepts come from experience. Okay, we aren't born with them. There are no innate ideas. Everything's coming from experience through this general kind of causal process. And the second thing is that all our knowledge comes from experience. Okay, so all of our concepts, all of our ideas come from experience, all of our knowledge comes from experience. How do you know that? Well, experience. Okay? Your experience or the experience of someone else, you can read about it in books, you can hear about it, people can tell you and so on, but that's the general concept. You learn about the world through experience. Okay, now, a lot of modern empiricists think there's no place for God in that story. But Aristotle disagrees. Aristotle thinks that story actually depends on a God. And that's the argument he gives you in Book Lambda, Book 12 of the Metaphysics. Okay, he gives you his argument for the existence of God. Now, how does that argument go? Why does he think this picture pushes you into thinking about the existence of a God, and in fact, forcing you, he thinks, to recognize the existence of a God? And what kind of God would that be? Yeah.
Any type of phenomenal experience?
Well, take any kind of experience, like seeing the banana. How could I get from seeing the banana to God? There is actually a story here about how I do. Something happens, right? Before, there's change. There is, in the Greek, kinesis, okay? Which is translated frequently as movement, but it also means change. And so let's take Joe here, who sees the banana. Table, banana on table. Goes, there's a banana, okay? There's another view of that, okay? Now, Joe sees the banana, and there's a change there, right? Why do I say there's a change there? There's some kind of movement, kinesis in Aristotle's sense. What happened? Good, there's a thought that wasn't there before. There's a perception that wasn't there before. It's not like he has been viewing the banana his entire life and suddenly said there's a banana. No, something changed, right? The thought, the perception itself was a change. And so this was some sort of change. Now we can say, well, what brought about that change? Banana, right? So the banana being on the table, his seeing it, his turning that direction, however we want to phrase it, something caused that. So there's some event here. Let's call this event, I don't know, E. And we can say that was brought about by some other event. So now it's unfortunate. I've got to go off to the right instead of to the left. So imagine that time is flowing this way. It will help if you know Arabic or Hebrew and can read right to left, okay? That's sort of too bad. I should have planned this better and written Joe over there. But imagine the time is flowing this way. This change has been brought about by something. What brought it about? Well, I don't know. Who cares? Something brought it about. And so there was some other change, some other event, let's call it E prime, that preceded that, and E prime caused this event E. Okay? So this is a causal process. Now, that change event, that event that was a change, right? That was a movement. That was something happened. That was an event. What brought it about? Something caused it. And so that was, let's say, E double prime. Now, this presumably goes on, E triple prime, and so on and so on. Could it go on forever? Yeah.
In the case of just Joe saying banana, the only primes that could go back were he had somebody deliver him a banana, let's see, that had a better concept of bananas than Joe did, so the information was carried through a person or another experience. But otherwise, it would just be like the life of the banana sitting on the table that grew from the tree, and then before it was a tree, before it was around.
Okay, good. Two important points here. One is, look, there are lots of events that bring about this seeing the banana, right? There was the fact that somebody brought the banana in the room and sat there. There was the fact that the banana grew on the tree and all of that. And so actually, it's not like there's really one event. There are a bunch of events. And so first of all, this is really some complicated network. It's not just something simple like what we've drawn here. It's this complex of all sorts of events that are entering in all sorts of ways, right? So that much is true. Now, the modern empiricist might say, and that's all there is. Just a bunch of stuff happening, okay? And we learn about it through experience. Life is just one damn thing after another. All this stuff's happening, blah, 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 blah. That's all there is to be said. Now, Aristotle is giving you an argument that that's not all there is to be said. In fact, that can't be the complete story. What is the nature of the argument? We're going to see many versions of this. Actually, that's not true. This is an argument that gets forgotten in the Platonist rush of the next several centuries and is revived by Aquinas. So we're not actually going to see all that many versions of this in this course. We'll see a few. But one version is to say, well, actually, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. There are lots of there are ways of simplifying Aristotle's story. But, and he gives you the most complex version of this argument in history. I mean, almost nobody gives you the argument in a form anything like Aristotle's because it's too complicated. Nobody can quite figure out what it is. But give me some arguments about why, some potential arguments, why maybe that's not enough. Why we can't just say, yeah, a bunch of stuff happens, right? Why did he see the banana on the table? Well, gee, the banana grew on a tree. Somebody bought the banana from a store, took the banana and sat it on the table. He turned in that direction. Blah, blah, blah. We just keep going back. Lots and lots of stuff has happened. Now, why isn't that the full story? Yeah.
What's the first cause?
Ooh, all right, good. One possible answer is to say, hold on a second. You're expecting me to believe that this goes back forever. Okay, so why the banana? Well, because of this, blah, 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 blah. Why that? Now we're back to the dinosaurs, okay? Well, really, that dinosaur caught a cold and sneezed. You've seen the Simpson episode where he goes back in time. Know what I'm thinking of? Well, anyway, yeah, it keeps going back. But eventually, suppose that's it. It's like, yeah, right, we got here somehow because there's this. Now, I want to know, all right, does this story causes? Does this go back infinitely? Does it go back forever? Then how did we ever get here? What time is it really by the cosmic clock? Well, it's now infinity plus something. I mean, how did we get here? How could it be an infinite? Is today's star date really an infinite number? How could that be? Okay, so one thought is, and it's a thought that Aquinas has, and a variety of other philosophers have too, and later in the medieval period, is to say this can't go on forever. It can't be that this is an infinite process. Why? Because we could never have gotten here. And so one solution to this is to say, look, there had to be a first cause. Now that would be a mover, a causer of change, but it would also have to be the first, and so it would have to be unmoved. Hence this concept of the unmoved mover, okay, the first cause. And indeed, that is the primary concept of God that Aristotle has. God is the first cause. God is the unmoved mover. The one who gets the whole ball rolling. Now, notice I can talk about, well, wait a minute, we get back to, let's say, the Big Bang. But then, the Big Bang just happened. Okay, that doesn't seem like an explanation. Aristotle would have to say, no, it can't be just some physical event. Now, here is where the complexity of the argument arises. He doesn't just stop here and say there had to be a first cause. He now says, that first cause has lots of different properties. So let's get rid of the philosophy of mind over here and go back to thinking about what properties Aristotle actually attributes to this unmoved mover. Now, incidentally, I want to come back to this question of why there is such a thing, because it's not quite as simple as to say, how did we ever get here in his account? But that's one way, that's the simplest way of seeing why he thinks this is true. There are actually, I think, several arguments he gives why there had to be a first element of that series. But now, okay, we've got a first element of the series, so he thinks we can establish in one way or another that there is this first cause, this unmoved mover. But now, it's not enough to just have that. Because indeed, suppose the argument is, aha, there had to be a first cause. Well, somebody says it could be like the Big Bang. Someone else says, no, it was like a giant flash of light. Plato comes onto the scene and tells you a story and says, the demiurge got the demiurge to create or build or whatever. Gosh, people don't appreciate a stupid pun the way I would hope you would. Anyway, this is something that, why is it only a demiurge thing? Well, we've only never done. Okay, so first cause, what other properties does Aristotle attribute to the first cause? What do we know, he thinks, about this first cause? And we're not going to get just on this. Now, one thing I shouldn't have quite erased yet is notice in that story about how we know things, there's really nothing but causal and logical arrows. There's nothing else, okay? So hence, the primary thought here is he's the first cause, because really, all of these relations that drive everything, including our knowledge, are causal for Aristotle. And so that's the basic thing to say about God. God is a being who is a cause. Now notice in Plato, the idea of God as perfection and God as somehow the home of the ideas of the realm of forms is oddly linked to creation. It's not an obvious connection to creation. Whereas for Aristotle, the thought of God as the creator, as the first cause, and indeed, to make it somewhat more familiar in a religious context, in other words, God is the creator of everything. That's his primary concept. But he doesn't stop there. He thinks we can know more about that creator. So, what else can we know? And how do we know it? Yeah?
Do you think maybe there's if there is some unmoved mover, that this unmoved mover has some sort of purpose or cause that he wants to, ultimately maybe he wants Joe to learn about the banana. He's not just doing something. He actually has some sort of plan or something.
Okay. We know that this first cause has some sort of plan. Now I think there's something correct in what you're saying, but something misleading too. So let's see if we can sort this out. Yeah?
That's assuming there's a causal plan originating from the first experience or the first instance of
Look, Aristotle elaborates 4 senses of causation, and 2 of them are relevant to this discussion. One is the idea of an efficient cause, and that's what we've drawn over there, the idea of the first cause. But the second is of the final cause. And so I think you're right to say that in his view, God is not only acting as the efficient cause, in other words, the first thing in a series of events, the first mover, but also as a final cause, the being that explains what it's all about. And so it's in that sense that God is not only a creator here, but also an explainer. It's ultimately all about God and the purpose that God has. So in that respect, I think you're absolutely right. Now, do we know anything about God's particular plan? Aristotle doesn't give us anything like that. So I think it's too much to say, God wanted you to see the banana, or anything of that sort. But nevertheless, what it's all about, that too is defined by God. So it's not just that God starts this process rolling. God is sort of, you might say, also the final cause, the goal toward which all of this is directed. Yeah?
Doesn't necessarily mean that if he caused this, he has to be in some way outside of his own creation. Right?
What is the connection between God and the creation? God must be able to create it, so God has to be able to exercise causal power with respect to it. On the other hand, we don't want to put God as just one object in a series, because then we'll say, wait. So I think that's an important point. There are a number of things that we're going to sort of deduce here as other properties of God. And one thing that I like in Aristotle is he's aware that if you're to use this to talk about a God as opposed to just some first event, you really do have to provide a link between this role of God as creator, as unmoved mover, and then these other properties. And indeed, one of them is God is not sensible, i.e. not part of the sensible world, but a different kind of substance altogether. Yeah?
If we're just wanting to personify the characteristics of this group, then wouldn't we just go back to the first cause would be the origin the fruit came from, for example, its parents, the tree. And then unless we were concerned about the evolution of the banana, that would be the first cause, as far as it being able to trace back the origin.
In terms of ordinary explanations, yes, absolutely. I mean, if I say, so why did you decide to take this class? You would give me an answer in terms of, oh, blah, blah, blah. You know, you're not going to say, oh, let's go back to the moment of the Big Bang. Okay? And so ordinarily, yes, we take explanations back to a certain point and no further, and we don't think in terms of causes that are very, very distant in time. It's not very useful for us to think about those. But I think Aristotle's thinking, well, yes, but if you say, yes, somebody planted the tree. Well, why did they plant the tree? What caused them to plant the tree? And, or maybe nobody planted it, right? It grew up there by accident. But then how did that happen? How did the seeds get there? And so there would be a story that ultimately leads you back further and further. The idea is to seek an ultimate explanation and an ultimate cause, not just a sort of local one. But you're right, almost always we just are content with the local ones in practice. Well, we have just like 1 minute left. So what are some other properties that he wants to attribute to God? What is God like? Yeah?
If God was always there, doesn't mean he's eternal.
Good. God is eternal. It's not just that he's the first flash in the pan. He's actually always been there. And that's part of this idea. He's not really just part of the sensible world. He is somehow this eternal foundation. We haven't yet seen the argument for that. That has to be argued. Yeah?
Maybe all causes are kind of contained within the first cause as a broader single event in a way.
Okay, yes. Yeah, sort of. Let me just say all comprehending, something like that. To capture the idea that in some ways this is all encompassing. This is not just sort of the first limited thing that in some series, but something that in a sense has the rest of it in mind. Other properties, yes?
Good.
Good, absolutely. Something that's very important for Aristotle is that God is a thinker. God is a thinking being. And what does God think? Only about the most excellent thing, namely himself. Okay? So he thinks about himself. He is thinking about his own thinking. God's a little self-centered in this encounter. Anything else? All right, well, we're out of time. And so we don't really have time today to look at the arguments for all of this. But he thinks there are arguments that connect you from this idea of the creator to all of these other properties. Next time we'll take a look, perhaps at some of those arguments, but mostly we're going to look at the gospel accounts and try to understand how Christianity actually arises on the scene in a more specific way.